Welcome to Truth Behind History. The stories are real, the impact is lasting. Today, we're diving deep into one of the most explosive labor conflicts in American history. But before the gunfire and the marches, before Blair Mountain became a battlefield, we have to understand the world that created it. Imagine living in a place where the company you work for also owns your house, runs your grocery store, and even prints the money you use. That was the reality for coal miners in Appalachia. These were known as company towns, tiny kingdoms ruled not by mayors or governors, but by coal operators. And their rule? Absolute. You see, workers weren't paid in cash. They were paid in something called scrip, basically monopoly money that could only be spent at the company store. Prices were jacked up, and wages were kept low. So the harder you worked, the deeper in debt you sank. It wasn't just an economy, it was an ecosystem of control. And the moment you dared to push back, you could be blacklisted, your name passed around to every other coal company, or evicted from your company-owned shack. Or even worse, unions? Forget about it. They were labeled dangerous, illegal. Any attempt to organize was met with firings, threats, or straight-up violence. This was more than just worker exploitation, it was systemic repression designed to crush dissent before it could grow legs. But here's the twist. The miners fought back. The United Mine Workers of America didn't drop from the sky, it rose from the ground up. Formed by miners themselves, the UMWA was a response to the suffocating grip of corporate power. It became a lifeline, a symbol, and eventually, a spark. And once that spark caught fire, everything changed. So now that we've set the stage, let's talk about the mechanisms. How exactly did these coal companies maintain such airtight control over every aspect of life? Well, let's start with law and order, or rather, who got to define it. Coal operators didn't just rely on the sheriff. They hired their own private armies. One of the most notorious, the Baldwin-Felts Detective Agency. Think Pinkertons, but with fewer rules and more bullets. These guys were armed, paid directly by coal companies, and sent into towns not to protect people, but to intimidate them. Surveillance, harassment, beatings, it was all part of the job description. And if someone tried to organize a union, let's just say they didn't stay on their porch for long. But the control didn't stop at violence. It ran right through miners' pockets. Remember that scrip currency we talked about? It was more than inconvenient, it was economic entrapment. You couldn't save it, you couldn't spend it anywhere else, and you couldn't escape it, because every single necessity, from food to medicine to clothing, came from the company store. At inflated prices, of course. That meant your boss controlled not just your income, but your cost of living. You were trapped in a loop that kept you hungry, tired, and desperate. And here's the real kicker. In many places, the government wasn't stepping in to help. It was stepping in to reinforce the system. Local officials were often on company payrolls. Literally, sheriffs were deputized by the same companies they were supposed to regulate. Judges, lawmakers, even school boards, they weren't neutral. They were part of the machinery. The boundary between corporate interest and public governance, it didn't just blur, it vanished. This wasn't just a company town. It was a company state. And when the people inside that state finally had enough, when they pushed back, that's when the powder keg really started to rumble. Alright, so we've got an oppressed workforce, a militarized corporate machine, and a political system that's more puppet show than protector. What happens when all of that pressure finally explodes? Enter Logan County, West Virginia. The spark that lit the fire was a name that should be carved into every labor history textbook: Sid Hatfield. Hatfield wasn't your typical lawman. He was a sheriff who actually supported the miners. Imagine that. A badge on the side of the working class. He stood up to the Baldwin-Felts agents. He testified against them. He became a symbol of resistance. And for that, he was executed. Broad daylight, on the courthouse steps, gunned down in front of his wife. This wasn't just murder, it was a message, a warning, but it backfired spectacularly. Instead of silencing the miners, it galvanized them. 10,000 of them, armed, furious, and unafraid, mobilized and marched toward Logan County. Rifles slung over shoulders, union pins on their shirts, demanding justice, demanding recognition, demanding to be treated as human beings, not disposable tools. Now pause for a second and let that number sink in. 10,000 miners. That's not a protest, that's an army. But instead of responding with negotiation or reform, the powers that be doubled down. The state, the feds, they didn't come to listen. They came with troops. They imposed martial law. The goal wasn't peace, it was suppression. And with that, the rebellion that had been building underground for years finally erupted into open conflict. What came next would be the largest armed labor uprising in American history. Welcome to Blair Mountain, where coal dust met gunpowder, and the American labor movement made its bloodiest stand. For 5 straight days in late August of 1921, over 10,000 miners squared off against a force of coalback deputies, armed private agents, and government troops. This wasn't a skirmish, it was a full-scale battle, and it was the largest armed labor uprising in United States history. The miners weren't out there with pitchforks. They had rifles, military tactics, and a cause worth dying for. They set up trenches. They used guerrilla strategies. Many of them were World War I veterans who knew how to fight, and why they were fighting. Now here's where it gets surreal. In a move that sounds more like a dystopian novel than a history book, private planes were used to drop bombs on the miners. Let me say that again. Explosives were dropped on American citizens on American soil. Some of those bombs were even left over from World War I. It was the first time in US history that aerial bombardment was used against civilians in a domestic conflict. That's not a footnote. That's a warning. And yet, despite the overwhelming firepower, despite the threats, despite the national attention, these miners held their ground for days. But they weren't reckless. When federal troops finally arrived in overwhelming numbers, wearing US uniforms and carrying military-grade weapons, the miners made a decision. They didn't want to be labeled traitors. They didn't want to turn their rebellion into a civil war. So they strategically withdrew. They laid down their arms, not in defeat, but in hope. Hope that maybe, finally, someone had listened. But as we'll see in the next chapter, that hope came at a price. The gunfire may have stopped at Blair Mountain, but the war against the miners didn't end. It just changed forms. In the immediate aftermath, the response was swift, brutal, and calculated. Hundreds of miners were arrested. Many were charged with treason against the state of West Virginia. Think about that. These weren't foreign invaders. They were American workers, many of them veterans, fighting for basic rights. And yet they were treated like enemies of the state. Trials followed. Public defenders were scarce. Evidence was shaky. But the message was clear: if you challenge the system will bury you, not just physically, but historically. Because here's where the real erasure began. Blair Mountain didn't just get covered up by dirt. It got buried by silence. The media, largely controlled by the same industrial interests that owned the coal fields, reframed the story. The miners weren't desperate workers pushed to the brink. They were radicals, anarchists, dangerous men who needed to be stopped. The narrative shifted, and just like that, the largest labor uprising in American history disappeared from textbooks, documentaries, and dinner-table conversations. Even the battlefield itself was almost lost. For decades, Blair Mountain was unmarked, unprotected, and unspoken of. At one point, coal companies even tried to strip mine the very mountain where the uprising took place, as if they weren't just extracting coal, but trying to erase history itself. And in many ways, they succeeded, but not completely. Because you're here now, listening, learning, digging it back up. So here's the question: was Blair Mountain just a chapter in a history book, or is it a mirror? Because if you zoom out, the echoes are deafening. Today, you might not see company script, but you do see gig workers locked into systems where they have no benefits, no bargaining power, and no real say. You might not see company towns, but you do see tech campuses that offer housing, meals, even dry cleaning, all tied to your job, just like back then. And you might not see armed detectives patrolling neighborhoods, but you do see surveillance tools, non-compete clauses, and legal contracts designed to keep workers quiet and disposable. Sound familiar? History doesn't always repeat itself, but it rhymes. And the struggle for dignity, for agency, for fair treatment in an economic system that prioritizes profit over people, that's not a relic, that's ongoing. Even now, workers across industries are reigniting the conversation. From warehouse floors to coffee shops, unionization efforts are rising again. And just like the coal miners of a century ago, these workers are facing resistance from powerful institutions who claim to speak for progress, but act to protect control. And maybe the most powerful legacy of Blair Mountain isn't the battle itself, but the fact that it was forgotten, erased. Because when a society forgets its struggles, it forgets its standards. And when the cost of freedom is buried under convenience, comfort, or corporate spin, history has a nasty way of digging itself back up. The Battle of Blair Mountain wasn't just about coal. It wasn't even just about labor. It was about the eternal tension between freedom and control. At its core, this story forces us to ask, what happens when power becomes too centralized, when one entity controls your job, your home, your food, your money, and even your law enforcement? You get dependence, you get silence, you get fear, but then you also get rebellion. You get people who say, enough. You get a spark, and even though that spark was almost extinguished, almost forgotten, it still smolders today. Because the truth is, no system of coercion, no matter how sophisticated or sanitized, can extinguish the human need for agency, for meaning, for dignity. That's what the miners fought for. Not just higher wages, but the right to choose, to live without being owned. And maybe, just maybe, that's what we're still fighting for now, in different ways, in different industries, but with the same essential question: who controls your life? And are you okay with the answer? Thanks for watching Truth Behind History. If this story made you think, if it opened your eyes to a hidden piece of our past, then do us a favor, like the video, leave a comment, and subscribe to the channel. And if you want to hear more, check out the podcast version of this episode, linked right in the description. We've got more forgotten truths, more buried battles, and more untold stories coming your way. Because the past isn't dead, it's just waiting to be heard.